Veteran and his dog visit his wife's grave. The box beneath the stone finally delivers justice. You're about to witness one of the most emotionally powerful stories of love, loss, and ultimate vindication that will leave you in tears while restoring your faith in the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. A decorated war veteran is about to make a discovery at his beloved wife's graveside that will not only honor her memory, but expose a conspiracy of silence that has protected the guilty for far too long. This isn't just a story about grief and remembrance. It's about how the deepest love can reach beyond death itself to ensure that justice is finally served and that those who thought they had escaped accountability will face the consequences of their actions. If you're ready for a journey that will take you through the depths of human sorrow to the heights of righteous triumph, then hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on those notifications, because what happens next will prove that some bonds are so strong they can never be broken, not even by death itself. The morning mist hung low over Evergreen Cemetery in small-town Millbrook, Tennessee, as Colonel James "Jim" Sullivan, recently retired from the Army Rangers after 25 years of distinguished service spanning 3 wars and countless classified operations, walked slowly along the winding gravel path that led to his wife's grave. The autumn air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of fallen leaves, the faint fragrance of chrysanthemums that had been planted throughout the cemetery for the season, and the underlying earthiness that seemed to permeate all places where the living came to commune with the dead. Each step on the familiar path felt both comforting and heartbreaking, a ritual that had become as necessary as breathing during the 18 months since Sarah's death. The path wound through sections of the cemetery that told the story of Millbrook's history, past weathered headstones from the Civil War era, through the neat rows of 20th century graves, and into the newer section where Sarah now rested among other members of the community who had passed too soon. Beside him walked Honor, a German shepherd whose grey muzzle and slightly slower gait betrayed her 9 years of age, though her intelligent brown eyes remained as alert and devoted as they had been during her 8 years of military service as Jim's working dog partner. The dog moved with the dignified bearing of a veteran who had served with distinction in places where courage was measured, not in medals, but in the lives saved and missions accomplished through unwavering loyalty and dedication. Honor had been with Jim through 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, had saved his life more times than he could count, and had become not just his professional partner, but an integral part of his family when he and Sarah had married 7 years earlier. The German Shepherd's service record included detection of over 40 improvised explosive devices, participation in more than 200 combat missions, and citations for valor that had made her one of the most decorated military working dogs in her unit. The bond between Jim and Honor had been forged in the crucible of combat, where trust between partners could mean the difference between coming home alive or not coming home at all. But that professional partnership had evolved into something deeper during the years when they had lived as a family with Sarah, becoming a 3-way relationship that had defined happiness and stability for all of them. Sarah had loved Honor from the moment Jim had brought the dog home on his first leave after their partnership began. Despite having no previous experience with military working dogs, Sarah had immediately understood Honor's importance to Jim and had welcomed the German Shepherd into their home and their lives with the same generous spirit that had made her such an extraordinary wife, nurse, and human being. Sarah Catherine Morrison had been 27 when she married Jim, a trauma nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, who had dedicated her life to saving others and who had brought that same commitment to caring for her husband and his military working dog partner. She had grown up in Millbrook, the daughter of a high school principal and an elementary school teacher, and had chosen to remain in her hometown after nursing school because she believed in serving the community that had shaped her. Her work at the hospital had been more than just a job. It had been a calling that had driven her to work double shifts, to volunteer for the most difficult cases, and to advocate constantly for patients who needed someone to fight for their care. Sarah had been the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's name, who stayed late to comfort families during their darkest hours, and who never accepted that a patient's condition was hopeless if there was still something that could be done. The 3 of them had formed an inseparable family unit during the brief periods when Jim had been home between deployments. Sarah had cared for Honor during Jim's absences, maintaining the dog's training regimen, ensuring that she remained physically and mentally prepared, for their return to active duty, and providing the love and companionship that had sustained Honor through the long separations from her primary handler. More importantly, Sarah had provided both Jim and Honor with the stability and purpose that had made their military service meaningful. Knowing that they were protecting not just abstract concepts of freedom and democracy, but a specific person who loved them unconditionally, had given both soldier and dog the motivation to survive the most dangerous situations and to return home safely. Sarah had also served as the bridge between Jim's military world and civilian life, helping him navigate the complexities of relationships and responsibilities that existed outside the clear hierarchies and objectives of military service. Her patience and understanding had made it possible for Jim to maintain his identity as a soldier, while also growing as a husband and civilian. The house they had shared on Maple Street had become a sanctuary where the stresses and traumas of military service could be processed and healed. Sarah had created an environment where Jim could talk about his experiences when he needed to and could find silence when words were inadequate. Honor had been an essential part of that healing environment, providing the kind of non-judgmental companionship that had helped Jim process experiences that were difficult to share with someone who had not been there. Now, as Jim and Honor approached the familiar white marble headstone that marked Sarah's final resting place, both man and dog carried the weight of a grief that had fundamentally changed their understanding of what life could be without the woman who had been the center of their world. The headstone was simple but elegant, bearing Sarah's name, the dates of her birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved wife, dedicated nurse, guardian angel," that Jim had chosen to capture the essence of who she had been to everyone whose life she had touched. The gravesite itself had become a place of pilgrimage for members of the community who had been touched by Sarah's life and service. Flowers were regularly left by former patients and their families, by colleagues from the hospital, and by friends who missed her presence in their lives. The constant stream of visitors had created an informal memorial that spoke to the impact that Sarah had made during her 34 years of life. Sarah Catherine Sullivan had died at age 34 in what had been officially ruled a single car accident on a rainy night in March, when her Honda Civic had apparently skidded off Route 127 and struck a large oak tree with sufficient force to kill her instantly, according to the Tennessee Highway Patrol investigation. The official report had concluded that the accident was caused by a combination of wet road conditions, excessive speed, and possibly driver fatigue, after Sarah had completed a double shift at Millbrook General Hospital, where she had worked as a trauma nurse for 6 years. The official explanation had never felt right to Jim, whose 25 years of military service had included extensive training in accident investigation, threat assessment, and the recognition of situations that were not what they appeared to be. Jim knew Sarah as one of the most careful and safety-conscious drivers he had ever encountered, someone whose experience treating accident victims had made her acutely aware of the consequences of careless driving. During their marriage, Sarah had never received a traffic ticket, had never been involved in any kind of accident, and had consistently demonstrated the kind of defensive driving skills that came from her training as a trauma nurse who had seen too many preventable injuries and deaths. She had been the kind of driver who always wore her seatbelt, who never exceeded speed limits, who avoided driving when she was tired, and who had frequently lectured friends and family members about road safety. More troubling had been the circumstances surrounding Sarah's death, details that had emerged during the investigation, but that had never been adequately explained by the official conclusion. She had been driving home from the hospital at 11:30 p.m. after working a double shift, but her normal route home would not have taken her anywhere near the remote section of Route 127 where the accident had occurred. The location was more than 10 miles out of her way, in an area that she had no reason to visit, particularly not late at night after an exhausting day at work. The route to the accident site required several turns off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads, culminating in a winding mountain road that was known to be dangerous, even in good weather conditions. Jim had driven the route from the hospital to the accident site multiple times, trying to understand why Sarah would have been in that location. There were no businesses, no friends' houses, no medical facilities, and no other destinations that would have justified the detour. The only possible explanations were that she had been lost, that she had been meeting someone, or that she had been forced to go there against her will. The accident scene itself had raised additional questions, that had never been satisfactorily answered. The damage to Sarah's vehicle had been consistent with a high-speed impact, but there had been no skid marks or other evidence that she had attempted to brake or avoid the collision. The absence of braking evidence suggested that she had either been unconscious at the time of impact or that her vehicle had been traveling too fast for effective braking. The investigation had also revealed that Sarah's cell phone had been found at the accident scene, but the device had been severely damaged in the crash, and the data could not be recovered. The timing of her last known phone call had been approximately 10:45 p.m. when she had called the hospital to clarify something about a patient's care, but there was no record of any subsequent calls that might have explained her presence on Route 127. Jim had raised these concerns with the investigating officers, but his questions had been dismissed as the natural grief and denial of a husband who couldn't accept that his wife's death had been a simple accident. The lead investigator, Detective Raymond Polk, had been sympathetic but firm in his conclusion that the evidence clearly supported an accidental death and that Jim's concerns were based on emotion rather than facts. Detective Polk had been a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department and had a reputation for thoroughness and professionalism. His investigation had included interviews with hospital staff, examination of Sarah's work schedule and personal relationships, and analysis of the physical evidence from the accident scene. According to Polk, every aspect of the investigation had supported the conclusion that Sarah's death had been a tragic accident. The autopsy had revealed no evidence of alcohol or drugs in Sarah's system, no sign of any medical condition that might have impaired her driving, and no indication of foul play. The autopsy report had noted that Sarah had died instantly from massive trauma, consistent with a high-speed collision, and that there were no defensive wounds or other signs that would suggest she had been the victim of violence prior to the accident. From the perspective of law enforcement, it had been a straightforward case of a tragic accident caused by dangerous driving conditions and human error. The combination of rain, darkness, an unfamiliar road, and driver fatigue had created conditions that had led to a fatal accident, despite Sarah's normally excellent driving record. But Jim's military training and experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed told him that something about Sarah's death was wrong. His years of combat experience had given him a highly developed sense for when situations didn't match their surface appearances, and Sarah's death had triggered every warning signal that he had learned to recognize during his military career. The inconsistencies that troubled Jim went beyond the unusual location of the accident. Sarah's behavior in the days before her death had been subtly different, though Jim had not recognized the significance at the time. She had seemed more tense and preoccupied than usual, had made several comments about problems at work that she had not elaborated on, and had asked Jim several times about his deployment schedule and when he would be returning from his final mission. In retrospect, Jim realized that Sarah had been trying to tell him something important without saying it directly, possibly because she had been concerned about who might be listening or what consequences might result from explicit communication. Her questions about his schedule had suggested that she had been planning something that required knowledge of when he would be available to help or support her. Sarah had also made several unusual arrangements in the weeks before her death, including updating her will, organizing important documents, and having several private conversations with friends and family members that they later described as feeling like goodbyes. At the time, these activities had seemed like normal life maintenance, but they had taken on sinister significance after her death. The weeks following Sarah's funeral had been a blur of grief, anger, and frustrated attempts to find answers that seemed to not exist. Jim had requested copies of all the official reports, had visited the accident scene multiple times, and had even hired a private investigator to review the case, but nothing had emerged that contradicted the official conclusion of accidental death. The private investigator, a retired Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent named Frank Morrison, had been thorough and professional, but he had ultimately concluded that the evidence supported the official ruling of accidental death. Morrison had acknowledged that some aspects of the case were unusual, particularly Sarah's presence on an unfamiliar road, but he had found no evidence of criminal activity or cover-up. Morrison's investigation had included re-interviewing witnesses, examining the physical evidence, and conducting background checks on people who had been in contact with Sarah before her death. The investigator had also reviewed Sarah's financial records, her phone records, and her work schedule to look for any patterns or connections that might explain her death. But despite the thoroughness of Morrison's investigation, he had been unable to find any evidence that contradicted the official conclusion. The private investigator had acknowledged Jim's concerns and had agreed that some aspects of the case were puzzling, but he had emphasized that unusual circumstances did not necessarily indicate criminal activity. Jim's grief had been compounded by a growing sense of isolation and suspicion that his questions about Sarah's death were making people uncomfortable, and that some residents of Millbrook wished he would accept the official explanation and stop asking uncomfortable questions. Several people had suggested that his investigation was preventing him from processing his grief properly, and that he should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on questions that had already been answered. The suggestion that he was somehow dishonoring Sarah's memory by refusing to accept that her death had been a simple accident had been particularly painful and infuriating. Jim knew that Sarah would have wanted him to seek the truth, regardless of how difficult or uncomfortable that search might be. She had been a person who valued honesty and justice above social comfort, and she would have expected him to fight for answers if the situation had been reversed. The pressure to accept the official explanation and move on had come from multiple sources, including well-meaning friends who were concerned about Jim's emotional well-being, family members who thought his investigation was unhealthy, and community members who seemed uncomfortable with the implication that Sarah's death might have been anything other than a tragic accident. But Jim had also detected subtle signs that some people were actively discouraging his investigation for reasons that went beyond concern for his emotional health. Several individuals who had been close to Sarah had become evasive when asked about her final weeks, and some of her colleagues at the hospital had seemed reluctant to discuss her work or to provide details about her state of mind before her death. The hospital administration had been particularly uncooperative, citing patient privacy regulations and internal policies that prevented them from discussing Sarah's work or providing information about her cases. While these restrictions were legally justified, they had prevented Jim from gaining a complete understanding of what Sarah had been doing during her final weeks and whether her work might have been connected to her death. Shauna had been Jim's constant companion through the dark months that had followed Sarah's death, providing emotional support and a sense of purpose that had helped him maintain some semblance of stability during the worst period of his life. The dog seemed to understand that their family had been permanently altered, and she had adapted her behavior to provide the comfort and companionship that Jim needed to survive each day. The German Shepherd's grief had been visible and heartbreaking, as she had searched the house for Sarah during the first weeks after the funeral, and had maintained vigil at windows and doors where she had previously watched for Sarah's return from work. Honor's military training had taught her to adapt to changing circumstances, but the loss of Sarah had challenged the dog's understanding of what constituted normal life. The military had been supportive during Jim's bereavement, granting him extended leave and offering counseling services that had helped him begin to process his grief. But the approaching end of his enlistment had forced him to make decisions about his future that felt impossible without Sarah's input and support. Jim had ultimately decided to retire from the army and to return to Millbrook, partly because it was where he and Sarah had planned to build their life together, and partly because he couldn't abandon his search for the truth about her death. He had used his military savings to purchase a small house on the outskirts of town, a place where he and Honor could live quietly while he continued to investigate the circumstances that had led to Sarah's death. The house was a modest two-bedroom ranch that sat on 3 acres of wooded land, providing privacy and space for Honor to exercise and patrol. Jim had chosen the location because it was close enough to town to maintain connections with the community, but isolated enough to provide the security and solitude that his military training had taught him to value. The transition to civilian life had been challenging for both Jim and Honor, as they had adapted to routines that lacked the structure and purpose that had defined their military careers. Jim had found part-time work, providing security consulting services to local businesses, while Honor had struggled to find outlets for the energy and skills that had been honed during years of military service. This morning's visit to the cemetery was part of a ritual that Jim had established during his first weeks back in Millbrook. Every few days, he would walk to Sarah's grave with Honor, bringing fresh flowers and spending time talking to Sarah about his investigation and his efforts to find the truth about what had happened to her. The conversations were one-sided, but they helped Jim organize his thoughts and maintain his sense of connection to the woman who had been his partner in every aspect of life. He would tell Sarah about the leads he was following, the people he had interviewed, and the obstacles he was encountering in his search for answers. The cemetery visits had also become important for Honor, who seemed to understand that the gravesite was a place where Sarah's presence could still be felt. The dog would often lie beside the headstone for extended periods, as if maintaining a vigil for the woman who had been such an important part of their family. Today's visit carried special significance because it marked the 18-month anniversary of Sarah's death, a milestone that felt both meaningless and profound. 18 months had been long enough for the acute pain of grief to evolve into a persistent ache, but not long enough for Jim to accept that he might never find answers to the questions that had tormented him since Sarah's death. Jim had brought Sarah's favorite flowers, white roses that she had always associated with new beginnings and hope, and he had planned to spend extra time at her grave, reflecting on their life together and his progress in seeking justice for her death. The roses were from the same florist who had provided the flowers for their wedding, and Jim had continued to buy them from that shop as a way of maintaining connections to happier memories. As Jim and Honor approached the headstone, Jim noticed something that immediately captured his attention and triggered the tactical awareness that had been honed by 25 years of military service. The ground around Sarah's grave appeared to have been disturbed recently, with subtle signs of digging or excavation that were inconsistent with normal cemetery maintenance. The disturbance was not immediately obvious and would probably have been overlooked by casual observers, but Jim's military training had taught him to notice details that others might miss. The pattern of the disturbed earth suggested that someone had been working around the gravesite, possibly during the night when their activities would not be observed by cemetery visitors or staff. The signs of disturbance included areas where the grass had been carefully lifted and replaced, subtle changes in the soil color that indicated recent excavation, and slight depressions in the ground that suggested something had been buried or removed. The work had been done by someone who understood the importance of concealing their activities, but not well enough to fool someone with Jim's training and experience. Honor had also noticed something unusual about the gravesite, and the dog was displaying the kind of focused attention that Jim recognized from their military service when she had detected something that warranted investigation. Honor's nose was working constantly, processing scents and information that human senses couldn't perceive, and her body language indicated that she was detecting something significant that required closer examination. The German Shepherd's behavior was characterized by the same intensity and focus that she had displayed during explosive detection operations, when she had alerted to the presence of dangerous materials that needed to be investigated by specialized personnel. Her training had taught her to distinguish between normal environmental conditions and situations that warranted human attention. Jim knelt beside the headstone and began examining the disturbed ground more carefully, using techniques he had learned during military investigations to assess the evidence without contaminating it. The pattern of the disturbance suggested that someone had dug a hole near the base of the headstone and had then carefully concealed their work, but not well enough to fool someone with Jim's training and attention to detail. The excavation appeared to have been conducted with professional tools and techniques, as evidenced by the clean edges of the disturbed areas and the careful replacement of the surface materials. The work had required several hours to complete and had been done by someone who understood both excavation techniques and the importance of concealing their activities from casual observation. The realization that someone had been tampering with Sarah's grave triggered a surge of anger and protective instinct that was almost overwhelming. The idea that someone would violate the sanctity of his wife's final resting place was intolerable, and Jim was prepared to take whatever action was necessary to identify and confront whoever was responsible for this desecration. But as Jim continued his examination of the disturbed ground, he began to detect subtle signs that suggested the disturbance might not have been an act of vandalism or grave robbing. The pattern of the digging appeared to be too careful and deliberate for random vandalism, and there were no signs of damage to the headstone or other cemetery property that would be expected if the goal had been destruction or theft. The excavation also appeared to have been focused on a specific area near the base of the headstone, rather than being random or exploratory. The precision of the work suggested that whoever had done it had known exactly where to dig and what they were looking for, implying advanced knowledge or planning that was inconsistent with casual vandalism. Honor's behavior was also inconsistent with what Jim would expect if the disturbance had been caused by hostile activity. The dog was alert and interested, but she was not displaying the defensive posture or warning signals that would indicate the presence of a threat or the aftermath of criminal activity. Instead, her behavior suggested curiosity and anticipation, as if she were detecting something that might be beneficial rather than threatening. Jim made the decision to carefully excavate the area where the ground had been disturbed, using a small folding shovel that he carried in his tactical pack as part of his standard equipment. His military training had taught him the importance of being prepared for unexpected situations, and the shovel was one of many tools that he carried out of habit and operational necessity. The excavation was careful and methodical, with Jim taking great care not to damage whatever might be buried beneath the surface. He worked slowly and systematically, removing soil in thin layers and examining each layer for signs of foreign objects or materials that might indicate what he was looking for. After about 20 minutes of careful digging, his shovel struck something solid that felt like metal or plastic rather than stone or wood. The sound of the impact was distinctly different from the sound that would be made by striking natural materials, and Jim immediately recognized that he had found something that had been deliberately placed in the excavation. Further excavation revealed a small waterproof box that had been buried approximately 18 inches beneath the surface, positioned carefully near the base of Sarah's headstone. The box was made of heavy-duty plastic and appeared to be designed to protect its contents from moisture and environmental damage over extended periods of time. The box was approximately the size of a shoebox, with secure latches and rubber seals that would prevent water infiltration, even if it remained buried for years. The construction suggested that it had been designed specifically for long-term storage in challenging environmental conditions, and that whoever had buried it had expected it to remain undisturbed for an extended period. The discovery of the buried box raised immediate questions about who had placed it there, when it had been buried, and what it might contain. The location suggested that it was somehow connected to Sarah, but Jim couldn't imagine any legitimate reason why someone would bury a box at her gravesite without informing him or seeking his permission. The timing of the burial was also puzzling, as the signs of recent excavation suggested that the box had been placed recently, possibly within the past few weeks or months. This timeline raised questions about why someone would wait more than a year after Sarah's death to bury something at her gravesite, and what might have motivated them to take this action now. Jim carefully extracted the box from its hiding place and examined it thoroughly before attempting to open it. The box showed no signs of recent manufacture and appeared to have been stored in a controlled environment before being buried, suggesting that its contents had been prepared some time ago and had been kept safe until the decision was made to bury them at Sarah's grave. There were no identifying marks or labels on the box that would indicate its origin or purpose, but the quality of the construction and the professional nature of the burial suggested that this was not a casual or spontaneous action. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that the box and its contents would be preserved and that they would eventually be discovered by the right person. Honor remained alert and focused throughout Jim's excavation and examination of the box, but the dog's behavior continued to suggest interest rather than alarm. Honor's military training included the ability to detect explosives and other dangerous materials, and her calm demeanor indicated that the box probably didn't contain anything immediately threatening. The German Shepherd's behavior also suggested that she might recognize something familiar about the box or its contents, though Jim couldn't understand what that might be. Honor had an extraordinary memory for scents and could recognize people and objects that she had encountered months or even years earlier, and her current behavior suggested that the box might be connected to someone or something that she remembered. Jim opened the box carefully, using techniques he had learned during military operations to minimize the risk of triggering any potential hazards. Inside the box, he found a collection of items that immediately changed his understanding of Sarah's death and launched him on a path toward the truth that he had been seeking for 18 months. The box contained a letter addressed to Jim in Sarah's handwriting, several photographs that appeared to show people and locations that Jim didn't immediately recognize, a small digital recording device, what appeared to be copies of medical records and official documents, and a backup computer hard drive that had been carefully sealed in anti-static material. The letter was sealed in a plastic bag that had protected it from moisture, and Sarah's familiar handwriting on the envelope was clear and legible. Jim recognized the pen that Sarah had used to write the letter, a special fountain pen that had been a gift from her parents when she graduated from nursing school, and that she had always used for important correspondence. The envelope also bore Sarah's personal seal, a small embossed design that she had used on formal letters and documents. The seal was something that only Jim and Sarah's closest family members would recognize, providing additional authentication that the letter was genuine and had been written by Sarah herself. Jim's hands were shaking as he opened the letter and began to read Sarah's words, written in the neat script that he remembered from their years of correspondence during his deployments. The letter was dated 2 days before Sarah's death, and its contents immediately made clear that she had been aware of danger and had taken steps to ensure that the truth about her situation would eventually be revealed. The letter began, "My dearest Jim, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and someone has silenced me before I could expose what I have discovered. I pray that you will never need to read these words, but if I am gone, then you must know that my death was not an accident, and that there are people in this town who killed me to protect their secrets." Sarah's letter continued for several pages, written with the careful precision of someone who understood that these might be the last words she would ever communicate to her husband. The letter detailed a conspiracy that she had uncovered during her work at Millbrook General Hospital, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the medical community, law enforcement, and local government. According to her account, Sarah had discovered that several prominent members of the community, including medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and local business leaders, had been involved in a scheme to cover up medical malpractice, insurance fraud, and even wrongful deaths that had occurred at the hospital over a period of several years. The conspiracy had apparently begun as an attempt to cover up a single incident of medical negligence that had resulted in the death of a patient, but it had evolved into a systematic effort to conceal multiple incidents of malpractice and to protect the careers and reputations of the people involved. The cover-up had involved falsifying medical records, intimidating witnesses, and using connections within law enforcement and the legal system to prevent investigations and prosecutions. Sarah's letter explained that the conspiracy had been motivated by financial considerations as well as professional reputation. The medical malpractice incidents had involved millions of dollars in potential liability, and the people involved had been willing to go to extraordinary lengths to avoid accountability for their actions. The scheme had also involved systematic billing fraud, where procedures that had not been performed were billed to insurance companies, and where complications resulting from medical negligence were treated as separate medical conditions requiring additional billable procedures. The financial scope of the fraud had been enormous, involving millions of dollars over several years. Sarah had apparently stumbled onto evidence of the conspiracy while reviewing medical records as part of her normal duties as a trauma nurse. Her attention had been drawn to patterns of unusual deaths and complications that seemed to be connected to specific medical staff members, and her investigation had revealed documentation that proved the existence of deliberate cover-ups. The letter explained that Sarah's investigation had begun when she had noticed inconsistencies in the medical records of several patients who had died under suspicious circumstances. The records had been altered to conceal evidence of medical errors, and the original versions had been destroyed or hidden to prevent discovery by oversight authorities. Sarah had been particularly troubled by the death of Maria Santos, a young mother who had died during a routine surgical procedure that should have been low risk. The official cause of death had been listed as an allergic reaction to anesthesia, but Sarah had discovered evidence that the actual cause had been a medical error that had been covered up by falsifying the medical records. The investigation into Maria Santos's death had led Sarah to discover a pattern of similar cases where patients had died or been seriously injured due to medical negligence, and where the evidence had been systematically concealed to protect the medical staff involved. The pattern had involved not just individual cases of malpractice, but a coordinated effort to prevent oversight and accountability. Sarah's letter described how she had spent several weeks gathering evidence of the conspiracy, working carefully to avoid detection, while collecting documentation that could be used to expose the truth and seek justice for the victims. She had photographed medical records, recorded conversations with colleagues, and gathered witness statements from other hospital staff members who had observed the cover-up activities. The investigation had been extremely dangerous, as Sarah had been forced to work in secret while surrounded by people who were actively involved in the conspiracy. She had used her access as a trauma nurse to review records and gather evidence, but she had been constantly aware that her activities could be discovered and that discovery would probably result in her death. Sarah's letter revealed that her investigation had been discovered by the conspirators, and they had threatened her life if she continued to pursue the matter. The letter described several incidents where Sarah had been followed, harassed, and explicitly warned that she would face serious consequences if she didn't stop asking questions and collecting evidence. The threats had escalated in the weeks before her death, with anonymous phone calls, threatening letters, and incidents of vandalism at their house that had been designed to intimidate Sarah into silence. The conspirators had made it clear that they were willing to use violence to protect their secrets, and that Sarah's safety depended on her willingness to remain quiet about what she had discovered. Despite the threats, Sarah had continued her investigation because she had believed that exposing the truth was more important than her personal safety. The letter explained that she had been motivated by her commitment to the patients who had been victims of the conspiracy, and by her belief that the cover-up would continue to result in additional deaths if it was not exposed. Sarah had also been motivated by her love for Jim and her desire to protect him from the consequences of her investigation. The letter explained that she had initially considered involving Jim in her efforts to expose the conspiracy, but she had decided that his military background would make him a target if the conspirators learned of his involvement. The final portion of the letter was heartbreaking in its love and concern for Jim. "I know that you will want to seek justice for my death, and I pray that this evidence will help you expose the truth and hold these people accountable for their crimes. But please be careful, my love. These people have already killed to protect their secrets, and they will not hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened." The letter continued, "Trust no one in local law enforcement, as some of them are part of the conspiracy. Detective Polk, who will probably investigate my death, is one of the people involved in the cover-up. Take this evidence to federal authorities who can investigate safely, and remember that I love you more than life itself." The letter was signed with Sarah's full name and included details about their relationship that only she would have known, confirming its authenticity and eliminating any possibility that it had been fabricated by someone else. Sarah had also included references to private conversations and shared experiences that would be impossible for anyone else to know. The photographs in the box showed various people engaged in what appeared to be clandestine meetings and activities. Some of the people in the photographs were recognizable as prominent members of the Millbrook community, including Dr. Richard Hawkins, the Chief of Staff at Millbrook General Hospital, and Detective Raymond Polk, the law enforcement officer who had investigated Sarah's death. The photographs had been taken covertly, using techniques that suggested Sarah had received training in surveillance photography or had been assisted by someone with such training. The images were clear and well composed, providing definitive evidence of meetings and activities that the participants would have wanted to keep secret. One series of photographs showed Dr. Hawkins meeting with Detective Polk and several other men in the parking lot of a restaurant outside Millbrook, apparently conducting business that they didn't want to discuss in their offices or other official locations. The body language and positioning of the participants suggested that they were discussing sensitive matters that required privacy and security. Another set of photographs showed the same group of men at various locations around Millbrook, including meetings at private residences, isolated locations outside town, and even what appeared to be a gathering at a hunting lodge in the mountains. The pattern of meetings suggested a coordinated conspiracy that involved careful planning and extensive coordination among the participants. The digital recording device contained hours of audio recordings that Sarah had apparently made during her investigation. The recordings included conversations with hospital staff members, meetings with potential witnesses, and phone calls that documented the conspiracy and the threats that Sarah had received as a result of her investigation. The most damaging recordings were conversations that Sarah had secretly recorded during meetings with Dr. Hawkins and other hospital administrators, where they had discussed strategies for concealing medical errors and preventing investigations. The recordings provided clear evidence that the conspiracy was real and that it involved systematic efforts to cover up malpractice and protect the people responsible. One particularly damning recording captured Dr. Hawkins explaining to another doctor how to falsify medical records to conceal a fatal error that had occurred during surgery. The recording included specific instructions about which documents to alter, how to create false entries in patient charts, and how to coordinate with other staff members to ensure that the cover-up would be effective. Another recording documented a phone conversation between Detective Polk and an unknown person, where they discussed strategies for preventing investigation of suspicious deaths at the hospital. The conversation included references to previous cases where investigations had been prevented or misdirected, and explicit discussion of how to handle future cases that might attract unwanted attention. The medical records and official documents in the box provided detailed evidence of the cover-up that Sarah had discovered. The documents showed patterns of falsified records, suspicious deaths that had been attributed to natural causes despite clear evidence of medical negligence, and correspondence between conspirators discussing how to prevent investigations and prosecutions. The medical records included original versions of patient charts that had subsequently been altered to conceal evidence of malpractice. Sarah had apparently gained access to backup copies or preliminary versions of records that had not been destroyed when the official versions were falsified. The documents also included financial records that showed unusual patterns of billing and payments that were consistent with insurance fraud. The records indicated that procedures that had never been performed were being billed to insurance companies, and that complications resulting from medical errors were being treated as separate medical conditions requiring additional billable procedures. The backup computer hard drive contained digital copies of all the evidence that Sarah had gathered, along with additional materials that she had not been able to print or photograph. The drive had been encrypted with military-grade security software, and Sarah had included the decryption key in her letter to Jim. The digital evidence included email communications between conspirators, financial records that documented the scope of the fraud, and video recordings that Sarah had made using hidden cameras to document meetings and conversations that the participants thought were private. The evidence was comprehensive and compelling, providing clear proof that Sarah had been murdered to prevent her from exposing a conspiracy that had resulted in the deaths of multiple innocent people. The documentation also made clear that her official cause of death had been part of the cover-up, and that Detective Polk and other law enforcement officials had been actively involved in concealing the truth about her murder. Jim spent several hours at Sarah's grave, carefully reviewing all of the evidence that she had gathered and left for him to find. The experience was emotionally overwhelming, as he processed both the grief of losing Sarah and the anger that came from learning that she had been murdered by people who had then lied to him about the circumstances of her death. The evidence also revealed the courage and dedication that Sarah had shown during her final weeks, when she had continued to investigate the conspiracy despite threats to her life and the knowledge that discovery would probably result in her death. Her commitment to exposing the truth and protecting future victims had cost her everything, but it had also ensured that the truth would eventually be revealed. Anna remained close to Jim throughout his review of the evidence, providing comfort and companionship during one of the most difficult moments of his life. The dog seemed to understand the significance of what they had discovered, and her presence helped Jim maintain the emotional stability he needed to process the information and plan his response. The evidence that Sarah had gathered was clearly sufficient to expose the conspiracy and to seek justice for her murder and the other crimes that had been committed. But Jim also understood that the people involved in the conspiracy still possessed significant power and influence within the local community, and that any investigation would need to be conducted carefully to avoid giving the conspirators an opportunity to destroy evidence or eliminate additional witnesses. Jim's military training had included extensive experience with intelligence gathering and criminal investigations, and he understood the importance of preserving the chain of custody for evidence and of working with appropriate authorities who had the jurisdiction and resources to conduct a proper investigation. The first step was to secure the evidence and to ensure that copies were made and stored in multiple locations where they would be safe from tampering or destruction. Jim carefully photographed every document and piece of evidence, uploaded the digital recordings to secure cloud storage, and made multiple copies of everything that Sarah had collected. Jim also created detailed documentation of the circumstances under which the evidence had been discovered, including photographs of the burial site, descriptions of the excavation process, and witness statements from cemetery staff who could verify that the gravesite had been undisturbed before his visit. The preservation of the evidence was crucial, because Jim understood that the conspirators would attempt to challenge its authenticity and admissibility if the case went to trial. By documenting every aspect of the discovery and preservation process, Jim could ensure that the evidence would be admissible in court and that its integrity would be protected. Jim then contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, providing them with copies of Sarah's evidence and requesting federal investigation of the conspiracy. He also contacted the Tennessee State Medical Board, the State Attorney General's Office, and federal agencies that had jurisdiction over medical fraud and civil rights violations. The response from federal authorities was immediate and comprehensive. The evidence that Sarah had gathered was more than sufficient to launch criminal investigations, and the involvement of law enforcement officials in the conspiracy meant that federal jurisdiction was clearly appropriate. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Memphis field office was assigned to lead the investigation, and she immediately recognized the significance of the evidence that Jim had provided. Agent Martinez had extensive experience with corruption cases and understood the complexities involved in investigating conspiracies that included law enforcement officials. Within days of Jim's report, federal agents had arrived in Millbrook to begin arrests and to secure additional evidence. The investigation moved quickly, as Sarah's documentation provided clear roadmaps to other evidence and witnesses that confirmed and expanded on her findings. The arrests began at dawn on a Tuesday morning, with coordinated raids on the homes and offices of the primary conspirators. Dr. Richard Hawkins was arrested at his home on charges of medical malpractice, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and accessory to murder. Detective Raymond Polk was arrested at the police station on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and murder in the first degree. Several other hospital staff members, local business leaders, and law enforcement officials were also arrested as the investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The arrests included nurses who had participated in falsifying records, administrators who had coordinated the cover-up, and business leaders who had benefited financially from the fraud. The arrests sent shockwaves through Millbrook, a small town where many residents had known and respected the people who were being charged with serious crimes. The revelation that prominent community leaders had been involved in a conspiracy that had resulted in multiple deaths was difficult for many people to accept. But the evidence was overwhelming, and as more details emerged during the investigation and subsequent trials, the community was forced to confront the reality that people they had trusted had been responsible for covering up crimes and murdering anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The investigation also revealed that the conspiracy had been even more extensive than Sarah had realized, involving corruption in multiple state agencies and connections to similar schemes in other communities throughout Tennessee. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in more than 40 arrests and prosecutions across the state. The trial proceedings revealed the full extent of the conspiracy and provided detailed accounts of how the cover-up had operated for more than 5 years. Witnesses testified about how they had been intimidated and threatened, how evidence had been destroyed or falsified, and how the conspiracy had protected itself by placing members in key positions within the medical and law enforcement communities. Sarah's evidence was crucial to the prosecution's case, and her courage in gathering documentation despite the threats to her life was recognized as an act of heroism that had ultimately brought justice to the victims of the conspiracy. The recorded conversations that she had made provided clear evidence of the conspirators' guilt and their awareness that their actions were criminal. The prosecution also revealed that Sarah's murder had been carefully planned and executed, with Detective Polk using his knowledge of accident investigation procedures to stage the crash and destroy evidence that might have revealed the truth. The murder had been designed to look like a tragic accident, while eliminating the threat that Sarah's investigation posed to the conspiracy. The trials resulted in convictions for all of the main conspirators, with sentences that ranged from lengthy prison terms to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Dr. Hawkins and Detective Polk, as the leaders of the conspiracy, received the harshest sentences and were convicted on multiple counts, including murder in the first degree. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions resulted in substantial settlements for the families of the victims, including Jim as Sarah's widower. The settlements included not just compensation for wrongful death and suffering, but punitive damages that were designed to punish the conspirators and deter similar behavior in the future. More importantly, the settlements included provisions for medical system reforms and oversight measures that would prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. The reforms included independent oversight of medical records, mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious deaths, and whistleblower protections for healthcare workers who reported suspected malpractice. The investigation also led to broader reforms within the Tennessee medical and law enforcement systems, with new oversight procedures and accountability measures that were designed to prevent the kind of cover-up that had cost Sarah her life. The reforms were named in Sarah's honor and were implemented throughout the state as a model for other jurisdictions. For Jim, the most important outcome was not the legal victories or the financial settlements, but the vindication of Sarah's memory and the knowledge that her courage and sacrifice had ultimately resulted in justice for all of the victims. The evidence that she had gathered and hidden at her own gravesite had fulfilled her final mission and had ensured that the truth would ultimately prevail. The box that Sarah had buried at her gravesite had been her insurance policy, her way of ensuring that even if the conspirators succeeded in killing her, their crimes would eventually be exposed and justice would be served. Her foresight and courage had made it possible for the truth to survive even when she could not. Jim established a foundation in Sarah's memory that provided support for medical whistleblowers and that funded reforms aimed at preventing medical malpractice cover-ups. The foundation also provided resources for families who had lost loved ones to medical negligence and who were seeking justice despite powerful opposition. The foundation's work included providing legal assistance to healthcare workers who witnessed malpractice, funding independent oversight of medical facilities, and supporting research into methods for preventing medical errors and cover-ups. The foundation had become a national model for protecting patients and supporting healthcare workers who were committed to maintaining ethical standards. Honor continued to be Jim's constant companion throughout the investigation and trials, providing emotional support and serving as a living reminder of the family that he and Sarah had built together. The dog had been present when Sarah's final gift had been discovered, and she had been part of the journey that had led to justice for Sarah's murder. 2 years after the discovery of Sarah's evidence, Jim stood once again at her grave with Honor beside him. But this time the visit was different. The headstone now included an additional inscription. Her courage brought justice, recognizing Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy and protecting future victims. The gravesite had become a place of pilgrimage for other families who had lost loved ones to medical malpractice and for medical professionals who were committed to preventing the kind of corruption that had flourished in Millbrook. Sarah's story had become an inspiration for people who were facing difficult decisions about whether to speak out against powerful interests. Jim had also used the site to establish a memorial garden where families could honor loved ones who had been victims of medical malpractice or other forms of institutional cover-up. The garden included a plaque that quoted from Sarah's letter, "The truth will survive even when we cannot." The memorial garden had become a place of healing and remembrance, where families could find comfort and strength in the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths had not been in vain. The garden also served as a reminder that individual courage could make a difference in fighting corruption and protecting others from harm. The box that had been buried beneath Sarah's headstone had contained more than evidence. It had contained Sarah's final act of love for Jim and her final act of service to the community that she had dedicated her life to protecting as a trauma nurse. Her courage in gathering the evidence despite mortal danger had saved countless future victims and had ensured that justice would ultimately be served. As Jim reflected on the journey that had led from Sarah's death to the exposure of the conspiracy, he understood that her murder had been intended to silence the truth, but had ultimately amplified it. The conspirators' attempt to cover up their crimes by killing Sarah had instead created the conditions that ensured their exposure and prosecution. The investigation had also revealed that Sarah's planned presentation of evidence to federal authorities had been scheduled for the day after she was murdered, making her death a desperate last-minute attempt by the conspirators to prevent exposure. The timing had made it clear that her murder had been carefully planned and executed as a specific response to the threat that her investigation posed. Honor's presence at Sarah's grave continued to provide comfort and connection to the woman who had been the center of their family. The dog's loyalty to Sarah's memory was evident in her behavior at the gravesite, where she would often lie near the headstone as if maintaining a vigil for the woman who had loved her. The discovery of Sarah's evidence had also provided Jim with a sense of purpose and mission that had helped him process his grief and find meaning in his life after Sarah's death. Working to expose the conspiracy and to honor Sarah's memory had given him a way to channel his love for her into actions that made a difference for other people. The investigation had also revealed the broader impact of Sarah's work as a trauma nurse, with testimony from patients and families about how her dedication and advocacy had saved lives and provided comfort during their most difficult moments. Her commitment to patient care had been recognized alongside her courage in exposing the conspiracy. The federal investigation had also uncovered additional evidence that the conspiracy had been larger and more extensive than even Sarah had realized. The cover-up had involved corruption in multiple state agencies and had protected crimes that extended beyond medical malpractice to include drug trafficking, money laundering, and other federal offenses. The prosecutions that resulted from Sarah's evidence had dismantled an entire network of corruption and had resulted in systemic reforms that protected future whistleblowers and made similar conspiracies much more difficult to maintain. Her courage had created a legacy that would protect countless people who would never know her name. The box beneath the stone had delivered justice not just for Sarah, but for all of the victims whose deaths had been covered up by the conspiracy. The evidence that she had risked her life to gather had given voices to people who had been silenced and had ensured that their deaths would be properly investigated and their families would receive answers. Jim's visits to Sarah's grave had evolved from expressions of grief to celebrations of her courage and legacy. The site had become a place where he could feel connected to her mission and could draw strength from her example of refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice. Honor's advanced age meant that their visits to the gravesite had become less frequent and shorter in duration, but the dog's devotion to Sarah's memory remained as strong as ever. Honor's presence during the discovery of the evidence had made her a part of Sarah's final mission, and Jim believed that Sarah would have been grateful to know that Honor had been there when the truth was finally revealed. The transformation of Sarah's grave from a place of unanswered questions to a symbol of truth and justice had been one of the most meaningful outcomes of the investigation. The site now represented not just Sarah's death, but her triumph over the people who had tried to silence her. As Jim prepared to leave the cemetery on this visit, he placed fresh white roses on Sarah's grave and spoke to her about the continuing impact of her courage. The foundation established in her memory was helping other families seek justice. The medical reforms implemented in response to her evidence were protecting patients, and her story was inspiring other people to speak out against corruption and abuse. The box that Sarah had buried beneath her headstone had been her final gift to Jim and to all of the people who would be protected by the justice that her evidence had made possible. Her foresight in preserving the truth had ensured that even death could not prevent her from completing her mission to expose the conspiracy and protect future victims. The veteran and his dog had visited a wife's grave seeking comfort in their grief, but what they had found was something far more important: the key to justice that had been waiting beneath the stone for the right moment to deliver the truth that powerful people had killed to conceal. Sarah's love had reached beyond death itself to ensure that justice would finally be served and that her sacrifice would protect others from the same fate. As Jim and Honor walked away from the cemetery, both man and dog carried with them the knowledge that love and truth were more powerful than corruption and death, and that some bonds could never be broken by those who sought to silence the voices of the innocent. The box beneath the stone had delivered justice, but more importantly, it had delivered proof that love and courage could triumph over evil, even when that triumph came at the ultimate price. The investigation and prosecutions that followed the discovery of Sarah's evidence had transformed Millbrook from a community where corruption had flourished in secret to a place where transparency and accountability were prioritized. The reforms that had been implemented as a result of Sarah's courage had created lasting change that would protect future generations from the kind of conspiracy that had cost her life. Sarah's final mission had been completed, and justice had been delivered not just for her death but for all of the victims whose suffering had been hidden by the conspiracy she had died to expose. The box beneath the stone had contained the key to truth, and that truth had set free not just the innocent, but the entire community that had unknowingly harbored killers in positions of trust and authority. The veteran and his dog had found more than justice at the gravesite. They had found proof that love transcends death, and that truth will ultimately prevail over even the most carefully constructed lies. Sarah's courage had reached across the divide between life and death to ensure that her mission would be completed, and that her love would continue to protect others long after she was gone.